The island of Aruba was supposed to be the perfect ending. May 30th, 2005. Palm trees swaying in the dark, music pouring out of crowded bars, hundreds of newly graduated teenagers celebrating freedom for the very first time. 18-year-old Natalee Holloway had spent the night out with friends at Carlos and Charlie's, laughing, dancing, doing what thousands of high school seniors had done before her on graduation trips meant to mark the beginning of adulthood. At some point in the early morning hours, Natalee was seen leaving with 3 young men. Her friends assumed she'd make it back to the hotel, but the next morning the buses loaded for the airport. Natalee never showed up, and in the single moment, a vacation paradise became the center of one of the most haunting missing persons cases in modern American history. I was 17 years old when Natalee Holloway disappeared, a high school senior myself. And if you were a teenage girl in 2005, you probably don't remember this case as just a headline. You remember it as a warning. Overnight, Aruba stopped feeling like a paradise. Graduation trips stopped feeling carefree. Parents who once said yes suddenly said no. My own family became terrified of letting us travel out the country at all. For 18 years, the world treated Natalee Holloway like a mystery. Cable news turned her disappearance into obsession, rumors became entertainment, and speculation became industry. But beneath the media frenzy was an actual teenage girl whose life had barely begun. Before she became a headline, Natalee was a daughter, a friend, a straight-A student, an 18-year-old girl celebrating graduation. And at the center of it all was a young man named Joran Sloot, a name that for years became synonymous with manipulation, lies, and one question no one could ever answer. What happened to Natalee Holloway? I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, a podcast where I examine the people, the psychology, and the moments that lead to the most extreme acts of violence, and what happens when the darkness finally meets the light. For years, the world was consumed by theories, headlines, suspects, and scandal. But before any of that, before the cable news countdowns and the courtroom confessions, there was simply a girl named Natalee. A teenager with plans for her future. A daughter her family adored. A friend her classmates described as kind, driven, and endlessly optimistic. Before Natalee Holloway became one of the most recognizable names in true crime history, she was just a girl from Mountain Brook, Alabama, the kind of town where people knew your family, showed up for football games on Friday nights, and celebrated their milestones together. By every account, Natalee was the kind of teenager people felt proud to know. She was an honor student at Mountain Brook High School, active on the dance team, ambitious, outgoing, and deeply loved by the people around her. Friends described her as bright, funny, compassionate, someone who could move easily between different social circles and make people feel included. Teachers saw a student with enormous potential. Her family saw a young woman standing right on the cusp of adulthood. She had plans, real ones. Natalee wanted to pursue medicine and had earned a scholarship to the University of Alabama, where she was going to study pre-med. Like so many 18-year-olds in May of 2005, she was living in that strange, exhilarating space between childhood and independence, close enough to home to feel protected, but old enough to believe the world was finally opening up for her. And if you were a teenager in 2005, you probably remember that feeling. Graduation felt invincible. Senior tropes were freedom itself. Parents trusted organized school vacations because they were seen as a safe, supervised celebration. One last adventure before college, jobs, marriages, and adult life truly began. That's part of why this case struck such a deep nerve across the country. Because Natalee could have been any girl on that trip. The smart girl, the responsible girl, the girl with plans, promise, and parents waiting for her to come home. The morning of May 30th, 2005 was supposed to be routine. Suitcases rolled through hallways, sleepy teenagers gathered in lobbies after nights of partying and celebration, chaperones worked to get nearly 100 graduating seniors organized and onto buses heading to the airport. But one student never arrived. At first, there was confusion, and then panic. Maybe Natalee Holloway had overslept. Maybe she was just in another room. Maybe she had gone to breakfast or gotten separated from her group. Except the minutes kept passing by, and her phone calls went unanswered. Friends started retracing the previous night in fragments. Carlos and Charlie's dancing, leaving with a group of young men. Someone saying she'd come back later. And then the realization that changed everything. Nobody actually knew where Natalee was. For teenagers on a graduation trip, that realization probably felt surreal at first. The kind of thing your brain refuses to process because bad things aren't supposed to happen in places that look like postcards. Aruba was a paradise, safe, beautiful, carefree, the sort of destination that parents trusted. But as the buses started to leave for the airport without her, confusion hardened into fear. And back in Alabama, Natalee's mother, Beth Holloway, learned that her daughter had vanished. And almost immediately, she jumped into action. Beth flew to Aruba within hours, accompanied by her friends and family, landing not as a tourist, but as a mother entering the worst moment of her life. There was no waiting period for hope to slowly fade. From the beginning, Beth understood that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong, and search efforts began immediately. Volunteers combed the beaches and vacant lots under the brutal Caribbean sun. Divers searched the surrounding waters. Local residents joined organized efforts to canvass the island. Missing person flyers appeared everywhere, taped to windows, handed out in crowds, shown endlessly on television broadcasts that were already beginning to turn the disappearance into international news. Soon, even the Texas Echo Search became involved, bringing in search teams, equipment, and experienced volunteers accustomed to looking for missing people in impossible situations. And through it all, one question kept surfacing. Who was the last person to see Natalee alive? Witness accounts eventually pointed investigators toward 3 young men who had reportedly left Carlos and Charlie's with Natalee in the early morning hours, including Joran Sloot and 2 brothers, Deepak and Satish Kalpo. At that stage, investigators focused on them for one reason and one reason only. They were the last people to have seen Natalee Holloway alive, and in the days ahead, their stories would shift, change, and contradict each other so many times that the line between truth and manipulation became almost impossible to separate. Within days of the Natalee Holloway disappearance, Aruban authorities detained 3 young men, Joran Sloot, Deepak, and Satish Kalpo, and from the very beginning, investigators were confronted with shifting stories. Accounts changed repeatedly, timelines moved, details contradicted one another. One version would place Natalee at a hotel. Another would claim they simply left her alone. Statements evolved under questioning, creating the sense that investigators were constantly chasing a moving target instead of a clear narrative. But suspicion alone is not enough to hold someone indefinitely. And under Aruban law, authorities actually face stricter evidentiary requirements surrounding prolonged detention. Investigators could not detain suspects simply for questioning if they had no physical evidence tying them directly to a crime. And so these detainments could not last forever. And despite public outrage and growing international media pressure, the suspects were all eventually released. Legally, this was considered a procedural decision, but emotionally, it was devastating. For Natalee's family, the people believed to be connected to her final hours who walked back into public life while their daughter was still missing, it was horrible. There was no body, no clear answers, no certainty about what happened after she got into the car with those men. Only the unbearable reality that the investigation was already starting to slip into ambiguity. As the search for Natalee Holloway intensified, the case stopped being just a missing person investigation, and it was a global media phenomenon. American cable news covered the story relentlessly. Networks aired round-the-clock updates from Aruba. Every development, every rumor, every search effort, every contradictory statement, it all became breaking news. Reporters flooded the island. Cameras followed Natalee's family all of the time. And before long, the disappearance of one 18-year-old girl had evolved into an international spectacle. And with the attention came enormous pressure on Aruban authorities. American commentators openly criticized the investigation, accusing the officials of being incompetent, being corrupt, or failing to take this case seriously enough because it was just a white girl from America. Meanwhile, Aruba itself faced growing scrutiny. Tourism is the island's economic lifeblood, and suddenly, paradise was being associated not with beaches and honeymoons, but fear, danger, and a missing American teenager. That pressure created a difficult environment for investigators. Every decision was politicized. Every delay became a headline, and every mistake was international news. And there's another layer to this case that's important to acknowledge, honestly. The disappearance of a young, blonde, middle-class white woman received a level of media attention many missing persons cases will never receive, something that they refer to now as missing white woman syndrome. Recognizing that reality does not diminish Natalee's story or the horror of what happened to her, but it helps explain why this case consumed the public consciousness in such an extraordinary way. In some ways, though, that overwhelming attention actually complicated the investigation itself and made it harder to find the truth. Because instead of investigators working quietly behind the scenes, they were all operating under the glare of worldwide scrutiny, political pressure, and a media machine desperate for answers long before they even had any solid evidence. By 2007, the investigation into the disappearance of Natalee Holloway surged back into headlines. Aruban authorities announced renewed investigative efforts after new statements and developing leads appeared to breathe life into the case. This case that had spent months trapped in uncertainty. Once again, investigators focused on Joran Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers. Once again, arrests were made. And once again, there was a brief moment where it felt like answers might finally be coming. But the deeper the investigators dug, the more tangled the case became. Statements continued to shift. Witness accounts conflicted with one another now. Some people recanted their earlier claims, while others introduced entirely new versions of events. Investigators were left trying to determine which details were genuine memories, which were intentional lies, and which had just become distorted after years of media attention and repeated interrogations. Ultimately, authorities ran into the same devastating wall they did in 2005. There was no direct physical evidence proving what happened to Natalee. That forensic gap is hard to fully appreciate now because modern audiences are used to thinking of technology as almost omniscient. Today, people assume phones track everything. Cameras are everywhere, and digital footprints can reconstruct entire timelines. But in 2005, it was a very different world. Cell phone location data was far less precise and way less accessible. Surveillance coverage was nowhere near what it looked like today. Social media geotagging didn't exist in the way we understand now. If I remember correctly, I think I got my first Facebook page in September of 2005. So there was virtually no social media. This was the beginning stages of social media. Digital forensics as a field was and still is developing rapidly, but the investigators lacked many of the tools that modern detectives rely on today. And perhaps most critically, they never found Natalee's body. Without Natalee's remains, prosecutors faced enormous challenges proving not only who was responsible, but even establishing the precise circumstances of her death. So despite renewed arrests and years of mounting suspicion, the case stalled yet again, trapped between public certainty and prosecutable proof. As the years passed, the disappearance of Natalee became something almost impossible for her family to emotionally escape, because the investigation never really ended. Instead, it just lingered in this agonizing space between hope and horror, where every couple months there was another supposed breakthrough, another witness, another confession, another claim from somebody insisting they finally knew what happened. There were stories about bodies being hidden or moved, rumors involving the ocean, claims tied to construction sites, house foundations, anonymous tips that sent investigators searching remote areas yet again. Every new lead reignited public attention, and it forced Natalee's loved ones back into the center of the nightmare, a nightmare they had never really been allowed to leave. And over time, something especially cruel began to emerge. Some people realized that this case had financial value, and they began to try to attempt to profit from the family's desperation by offering information in exchange for money. Other people inserted themselves into the story for attention, relevance, or just notoriety. False leads multiplied. Sensational claims spread across tabloid journalism and television programs before the investigators could even verify it. For the public, these stories were headlines, but for Natalee's family, they were just emotional torture. Every new claim carried the possibility, however small, that this might finally be the answer. It might finally bring her home. And every time those leads collapsed into lies or dead ends, the grief started all over again. That is one of the cruelest realities of unresolved cases. The trauma doesn't happen only once. It happens repeatedly, over years, every time hope is weaponized against the people who are still searching for answers. There's a specific kind of grief that asks, There's a specific kind of grief that experts sometimes call ambiguous loss. The trauma of losing someone without certainty, without resolution, and without the ability to ever really say goodbye. And for the family of Natalee Holloway, that was their reality for almost 2 decades. Most grief, painful as it is, eventually forces a sort of finality. There's a funeral, a burial, a moment where the world acknowledges what happened, and the people who are left behind can begin the impossible process of learning how to live without the person they love. But ambiguous loss traps families in emotional suspension, because what do you do when there isn't a body? What if there's no timeline, no clear truth? How do you mourn someone when part of your mind is still searching and hoping that they're still alive? Hope itself becomes painful. Every phone call carries dread. Every lead reopens the wounds. Every birthday, graduation, holiday, or family milestone is haunted by absence and the unanswered questions. The time keeps moving for everyone else, but the family remains psychologically tethered to the moment when their loved one disappeared. And through all of it, Beth Holloway continued fighting publicly for answers, year after year. She gave interviews, worked with investigators, advocated relentlessly to keep Natalee's case visible long after media attention began to fade. And there's something profoundly heartbreaking about watching a parent forced into that role, not allowed the privacy to grieve quietly because the search for truth has not ended. For 18 years, Beth Holloway lived in the space between hope and mourning. And that might be one of the most devastating forms of grief a human can ever endure. And then in 2023, nearly 2 decades after the disappearance of Natalee Holloway, the case returned to court, not in Aruba, this time in Alabama, where federal prosecutors took up a new angle rooted in extortion and deception. The case centered on years of contact between Joran Sloot and Natalee's family, during which he allegedly demanded money in exchange for information about what happened the night she disappeared. According to prosecutors, what was presented as answers was instead just manipulation, a cycle of false promises tied to a family still very desperate for truth. It was through this extortion investigation that a confession finally surfaced. Not a courtroom revelation in traditional sense, but a negotiated admission as part of a plea deal with federal authorities. In exchange for resolving the extortion charges, Sloot provided details regarding Natalee's death. Information that, for the first time, appeared to confirm what had long been feared but never proven. He admitted that he and Natalee had kissed on the beach, but said she rejected his further advances. According to his statements, when he attempted to escalate the encounter, she pushed him away and kneed him in the groin in response. He then described reacting violently, stating that he kicked her in the face extremely hard, rendering her at minimum unconscious and possibly already deceased. He then made sure that she was dead by hitting her with a cinder block he found on the beach. He further confessed that he attempted to conceal what happened by moving her body into the ocean after the incident. He also admitted that his previous explanations over the years, including claims that she had drowned accidentally or that her remains had been buried by his father, were all false. And then finally, he admitted that he had attempted to extort $250,000 from Beth Holloway in 2010. And yet, even in that moment, there wasn't much relief. There wasn't a resolution that felt clean or complete, only the slow confirmation of something devastating. After the plea, Beth Holloway issued a statement that stripped away the remaining ambiguity. He is no longer a suspect. He is the killer. It was a line that carried finality, but not closure. Because even after 18 years of searching, the truth that arrived was not something that healed the wound. It just defined it. In the years that followed the disappearance of Natalee Holloway, the world often reduced her to a question mark, a headline, a mystery to be solved, a story defined by what was taken from her. But even in the final confirmation that emerged from the 2023 confession tied to Joran Sloot and the 40-year sentence, there was something her family refused to let disappear. Her humanity. Because Natalee was never just an absence. She was someone who existed fully in the world before she was taken from it. She was a daughter who was deeply loved, a friend who showed up for the people around her, a young woman with plans, ambitions, a future she had every reason to expect would unfold. And in that sense, her story cannot be defined only by how it ended. It has to include how fiercely she lived. Even in the way her family fought for her, especially Beth Holloway, there was a refusal to let Natalee become symbolic or distant. Every interview, every search effort, every year spent pushing for answers was an insistence that she still mattered as a person, not just a case file. And maybe that's the part that lingers most after everything else is stripped away. Not just that she disappeared, but that she was loved enough that the world refused to stop saying her name. She fought like hell, even when she couldn't speak for herself anymore, because everyone who loved her refused to let her story be reduced to silence. In the years after the disappearance, her case quietly reshaped how families, schools, and travel programs think about safety for students leaving the country. One of the most lasting impacts was the creation of the Natalee Holloway Resource Center, established to help families of missing persons and to support awareness around travel safety, especially for young Americans studying or vacationing abroad. It became a place not just for resources, but for education, pushing schools, parents, and travel organizations to think more seriously about preparation, supervision, and what to do in the critical first hours when someone goes missing. Her case also changed how graduation trips and student travel programs are approached. What was once seen as a carefree rite of passage began to include more structured safety planning, clearer accountability, and more honest conversations between parents and institutions about the risk. But there's another legacy, too, one that sits more uncomfortably in how we tell stories like this. Natalee's case became part of the modern true crime landscape, where victims are sometimes turned into symbols or mythology, and their stories are consumed more for mystery than humanity. It's easy in cases like this to become fixated on the perpetrator, the timelines, and the unanswered questions until the person at the center slowly disappears from the narrative all over again. That's why it matters that we always speak about Natalee, not as a mystery, not as a headline, but as a reminder that she was a real person whose life mattered long before the world tried to solve her case. If you strip everything away, the headlines, the investigation, the confessions, the years of noise, what remains is something painfully simple. Natalee Holloway should have grown up. She should be in her 30s now. She should have finished college, started her career, built a life that felt ordinary in all the ways that make a life feel real. There should be birthdays with friends who have known her for decades, family photos that include new faces, stories that shift from childhood memories into adult milestones. But instead, her life stopped at 18. And for her family, that absence didn't freeze time. It reshaped it. 18 years is long enough for grief to change form over and over again. Long enough for hope to blur into exhaustion and exhaustion to turn into something quieter but no less heavy. Through all of it, Beth Holloway has carried her daughter forward in the only way she knows how, by speaking for her, by telling her story, refusing to let her become just another unsolved case lost to time. There is a version of this story that ends with resolution, but there's another version that simply ends with absence. And even in that absence, Natalee is still present in the lives of the people who loved her. Not as a mystery, not as a symbol, but as a daughter who was here, who mattered, and who should have just had more time. As we close this episode, I want to leave you with something practical, not just reflection. If you're traveling, especially internationally, take time to learn local safety resources before you go. Share your location with trusted people. Travel in groups whenever possible. Know who to contact in case something goes wrong. If you want to support missing persons advocacy, organizations like the Texas Equus Search continue to help families search for answers when the world has already moved on. Because cases like Natalee's are not just stories we tell. They are reminders of how quickly a life can change and how deeply it matters to never stop saying their name. There's something about this case that always stuck with me. Maybe it's because I recognize that feeling, that specific kind of an invincibility that comes at 18 years old. When you're graduating, planning trips, saying yes to the world before you really understand what it can take from you. I've thought about this a lot while putting this episode together. Not in a way that makes the world feel smaller, but in a way that makes it feel real. Because most of us has had a moment where we assume distance equals safety, where paradise feels separate from danger, where you believe that celebration somehow puts you outside of consequence. But that isn't how the world works. Natalee's story is a reminder that life doesn't pause for milestones, and celebration does not suspend risk. Sometimes the moments we remember as the most carefree are the ones that sit close to something irreversible. And still, what lingers most isn't fear. It's a reminder that Natalee was here, that she mattered, that she was loved fiercely enough that her name never disappeared, even when the answers went missing. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been another episode of When Killers Get Caught. And as always, the truth always leaves a trail.